So very, very first question on the airwaves right now is going to be, why does the Gospel of Matthew claim that John the Baptist is the reincarnation of Elijah the prophet? And I want to know, and I know everybody else does, why did John the Baptist deny it whenever he was asked? And anything else you want to throw in there would be juicy.
This is a very interesting question. And I think for most of the listeners, this is a very surprising question. Some people are going, what are you talking about? So first, a little bit of a background. The very last prophet in the Jewish scriptures is Malachi, Sefer Malachi. At the very end of the book of Malachi, we are told about the final redemption, the Messianic age, and how the children of Israel return to the Torah, the fathers will turn to their children, children to their fathers, and Elijah the prophet will come and usher in the final redemption. Elijah the prophet is the one who is bringing the coming of Mashiach, who is going to usher it in, and please God, may it happen quickly in our time. Now, as it turns out, I'm sure some of the viewers are wondering, well, in Christian terms, Christians believe that the book of Malachi is a part of a holy writing, is part of Scripture, capital S. Where then was Elijah the prophet ushering in Jesus, if Jesus is the Messiah? What do Christians make of this? And the answer is not as straightforward as I think some people would like, because it depends. It depends which book in the Christian Bible you're looking at. According to what's called the first gospel, according to the gospel that's called Matthew, John the Baptist, a very, very large figure in the synoptic gospels, is in fact Elijah the prophet. Jesus tells the disciples, and they are to understand both in Matthew 11 and Matthew 17, that in fact John the Baptist, who is this figure we are told is baptizing folks in the Jordan River for the remission of sins. He is the one who's Elijah the prophet. His role is to call out and say, turn to Jesus. And in fact, if you look at Mark's gospel, and which opens with the baptism of Jesus, in Matthew, Luke, John the Baptist is very, very prominent in the beginning of Jesus's career, ministry, so-called ministry. So therefore, it would stand to reason that Matthew would come up with somebody, particularly John the Baptist would be perfect. It is also extremely likely that John the Baptist is a real historical figure based on Josephus. So it would make a lot of sense that Matthew would identify John the Baptist as the person who is ushering in the coming of Jesus, who is introducing Jesus. And he plays in fact, John the Baptist's speech in the book of Matthew is much more elaborate than we find in the book of Mark. That's what we would expect to find, and we find that in the Synoptic Gospels. Here's what we don't find in the book of John. We don't find in the book of John an interest in demonstrating Jesus' messiahship, his sonship, and the things that occurred during his ministry from the Jewish scriptures. In fact, the fulfillment citations, which are unique really to Matthew, this was done to fulfill what was said in the Holy Scriptures, we find 11 of those in the book of Matthew. We really don't find that in other Gospels. But in the book of John, there's a lot we don't find. I need to explain this point. John seeks to diminish the role of many other people that are very prominent in the first three Gospels. For example, Mary, just the mother of Jesus, is never even mentioned by name in the book of John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of course. Luke, very, very prominent. In the book of John, we are presented with a Jesus which is of a very high Christology, which means that we are going to, in the first 18 passages of the book of John, we are introduced to what's called the prologue. What comes into view is an image of Jesus, a portrayal of Jesus that is higher, that is of on a higher level than any of the synoptic gospels. Remember, John is the last of the four gospels. Now, when I say the word last, I don't mean last that it appears fourth of the four gospels. I mean that it's chronologically written last. The book of John is probably written somewhere around 95. That's 65 years after Jesus' crucifixion, when Christians believe that Jesus was crucified. The book of Mark, probably 25 years younger. The book of Mark is probably written about the year 70, about the time of destruction of the Second Temple. Matthew and Luke, written about 15 years later, about the year 80, 85, and John about 10 years after Matthew and Luke. The point is that we can mark the four Gospels in order, not as they appear in the Christian Bible, but in their chronological order, and we can see an improvement of Jesus, meaning Jesus becomes a higher state. He's more important. Moreover, his sonship begins at an earlier state. So in Mark, we are introduced to Jesus as an adult. The author of Mark did not consider anything about Jesus' conception, his birth, the city in which he was born to be interesting at all. There's nothing unique about how Jesus was conceived as far as Mark was concerned, and there's no mention of it. Why? Because that's earlier. Mark is considered an adoptionist, is conveying an adoptionist Christology, which means there's no virgin birth, he wasn't conceived of a virgin, but Jesus becomes such a great person that he's adopted by God at his baptism, and he's informed directly in the second person, "You are my son." As far as Matthew and Luke is concerned, we're going to a higher Christology where Jesus becomes the Son of God at his conception. In fact, we're told as much in the Annunciation in the book of Luke, that in fact Jesus becomes the Son of God at the moment when in fact Mary will conceive through the Holy Spirit. Explicitly we're told that. So now if you notice that Jesus becomes the Son of God at an earlier state, not at his baptism, but at his conception and birth. John is not interested in any of this. He wants no part of this. For John, we're introduced to Jesus as the Logos. Now, as you open up John, right away in the beginning was the Word, which matches Genesis 1. It's clear what John is doing. We don't quite know to 14 who he's talking about. We know, but John doesn't mention it. By the time we get through 14 and 17, we know clearly we're talking about Jesus. As far as the author as John is concerned, Jesus became the Son of God, came into existence in the ether sometime in the eternal past. That's a very, very high Christology. Nothing else like that anywhere in the Christian Bible. And therefore, any of the theological accoutrements, such as Elijah the prophet, for John, Jesus is so high. The Christian religion has developed so far, you don't need Jesus born of a virgin. That's completely unnecessary. In fact, not only is his birth unnecessary, Jesus' mother, as I mentioned, is not mentioned by name, and the first time we introduced her only as the mother of Jesus, it's we are told at a miracle in Cana where Jesus changes water into wine at some wedding. I never understood how folks in the Assemblies of God work through that they turn water into wine, because they don't drink wine. They should be changing wine to water. But anyways, the key is he says to his mother, "Woman, what do I have to do with you?" Mary is diminished, not just that her name has been removed. This is the mother of Jesus. This is not the other Marys that are mentioned in the Gospels, but she is diminished. What do I have to do with you? That means that I didn't get here because of you. As far as Matthew, Mark, and Luke are concerned, Mary is very important, particularly in the book of Luke. Mary sits in the highest possible position in Luke's very elaborate infancy narrative. The book of John the Baptist doesn't even baptize Jesus. Jesus is never baptized in the book of John. I know that sounds very strange to you, and you're like, really? Very rarely. And therefore, In John 1:21, when John the Baptist is asked, "Who are you? What role do you play? Are you Elijah? Are you a prophet?" John the Baptist, as far as the author of the book of John, there's two separate people: John the Baptist, as opposed to John, the son of Zebedee, one of the disciples. John, who we are told by the church is the writer of the book of John, has John the Baptist saying, "No, I'm not a prophet, I'm not Elijah." So here we have Matthew clashing with John completely. Now, bear in mind that many things, because John is writing as I said, is presenting Jesus in the highest possible Christology, many of the things that we would encounter in the Synoptic Gospels, meaning in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we would never expect to find in the book of John. We would never, in fact, expect to find the transfiguration of Jesus. Transfiguration features very prominently in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when James, Peter, and John accompany Jesus to a mountain where Jesus is radiating, and Jesus meets with Elijah and Moses on a mountain. That story, while it appears in Matthew 17 and Mark 9 and so on, we do not find that in the book of John at all. Why? Because the reason why you have a transfiguration in the Synoptic Gospels is to lend importance to Jesus. Look at this. Jesus is encountering the most important prophets in the Jewish Bible. And therefore, that gives Jesus a stamp of approval, that he's the fulfillment of the great prophecies found in the Jewish scriptures. He is the person who has the stamp of approval from the most noted prophets in the Jewish scriptures. As you would expect, based on what I told you, you would never expect to find the transfiguration of Jesus in the book of John. Why? Because John's Jesus doesn't need a transfiguration. I'm already writing in 95. I don't need Moses and Elijah to prove Jesus. Therefore, he's not there. You'll never find, for example, the temptation in the wilderness in the book of John. There's no need for that. Not only, it goes even further. As far as John is concerned, it's not clear that John believed that Jesus was born in the city of Bethlehem, because in John 7, we find a very strange conversation where non-Christians, Jews, are going, "How could Jesus be the Messiah? He wasn't born in Bethlehem, he's from Nazareth." Now, the author of John, the narrator, if he thought that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and he was born in Bethlehem based on some prophecy, like Matthew has us believe in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, based on a text that's completely shattered from Micah chapter 5, verse 2 in the Christian Bible, Matthew 5, verse 1 in the Jewish Bible, the author, the narrator in John, should have gone, "No, he was born in Bethlehem." It's dropped. It's so strange. In the book of John, in John 7, those who oppose Jesus are going, "Well, how could he be the Messiah? Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. This guy's from Nazareth." Well, that's like a softball, like hit it out of the stadium. Just scream, "Of course he was born in Bethlehem." Didn't you read the book of Matthew? Didn't you read the book of Luke? Now, they obviously didn't read each other. It should be also said, it might surprise you, that John is a very, very different kind of book than the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, the word synoptic is a compression of two Greek words, synoptic, which essentially means with one or the same view. John is so different in that roughly 90% of what we find in the book of John is found nowhere in the Synoptic Gospels. So again, John, the author of the book of John, is not interested in having somebody baptize Jesus. Why? Because generally speaking, if someone baptizes another, like today, you have Christians who go on a pilgrimage to Israel. They go to the Jordan River, and a pastor takes new converts to Christianity, and he dunks them inside the Jordan River. Okay? The key is that you have someone who's spiritually superior baptizing someone who's spiritually inferior, in some sense. And here, how is John, the author of the book of John, who is presenting Jesus now as not becoming the Son of God at his baptism, not becoming the Son of God at his conception or birth like Matthew and Luke, but now he is somewhere in the beginning, all the way in the beginning before the world was created. He's the Logos, he's the Word. I'm not going to get into what exactly does Logos mean. It's a term that was used extensively by Philo of Alexandria. There's no doubt that that's where John and Paul would take their cues, but that's a completely separate topic. So the reason is very simple. Whoever wrote the book of John was not sitting there going, all right, let me look at Matthew, hold on for a second, let me look at Matthew, because there's so much of Matthew which is not found in John, and there's so much of John that has nothing to, there's nowhere to be found in Matthew. In fact, if John had read the book of Matthew, and Matthew was a well-established book, this didn't happen. He would have never have written his passion narrative and resurrection account in John chapter 20 to completely contradict Matthew's resurrection account. They're entirely different. They have nothing to do with each other. They're completely incompatible with each other. So, in short, rolling back, this is in the first century. This is not at a time when people had access to books. This is a time of mass illiteracy. This is when these Christian Gospels are written by highly literate Christians at the second half of the first century. It's not going to be established until 100 years later. It means until we have the Bishop of Lyon, roughly in about the year 180, clearly establishing that Matthew is the disciple Matthew, is the author of Matthew, that Mark, the assistant of Peter, or companion of Peter, is the author of what we know the book of Mark. Luke, a companion of Paul, is the author of the book of Luke and Acts, and John was written by the disciple John. In the book of John, it's very clear that John is not, the writer himself states at the end of the book that he got this from the disciple Jesus loved, meaning it's not him. So this is very late. And it's very important for us to sort of bring us back to the first century. We have different Christian communities in the first century, and Christianity is developing differently. Yes, it's true that there's no question that whoever wrote the book of Matthew and Luke, they had the book of Mark in front of them. No doubt about that. Why? Because virtually all the book of Mark appears in Matthew and Luke. We know that there's information that Matthew and Luke were relying on, whoever wrote them, that we don't have that original source for, but they were copying from that same source. And then they had their own own sources that developed in their community. Very, very different, very, very separate. But John as a whole is really a very different kind of book, a book with huge dialogues. But the key is, Jesus is now portrayed with the highest possible Christology. What you can see the way Jesus portrayed going to the cross. He doesn't even need Simon to help him carry the cross. He's way, way up. He's way up. And as therefore, many of the things, meaning having John the Baptist play the role of Elijah the prophet, he's not interested in that. Transfiguration, the book of John, not interested in that. Or any prominent role for Mary, not interested. In fact, Mary is a problem. Mary is a problem because we have to diminish Mary, the mother of Jesus. We have to diminish her position, and she's quite specifically diminished, where Jesus is made to say, woman, what do I have to do with you? And believe me, Christian commentators spin in many, many circles to explain why Jesus would talk to his mother that way. But what is very clear is Jesus is saying, woman, what do I have to do with you? So he's calling his mother woman, which would be disrespectful. He's speaking to his mother and saying, what do I have to do with you? That's very important. He's saying, what do I have to do with you? Meaning, I didn't become the Son of God through you. It's not you. You're not my conduit. As far as Luke is concerned, it's her. Mary is everything where Jesus becomes the Son of God through her, that the Holy Spirit comes upon her. And because of that, Jesus is the Son of God. John will have no part of that. And therefore, we don't, as far as John, the book of John, denying that John the Baptist is the larger prophet diminishes John's role, and therefore, Jesus is therefore in the highest, most prominent level. He is divine. Now, he's not divine in the sense of full-blown God. As far as the author of the book of John is concerned, Jesus is still subordinate to the Father in every way. And he's the highest Christology. Remember, when we're using terms that we're saying that the author of the book of John saw Jesus as a divine being, we don't mean that in our conventional sense that Jesus was absolutely God, created the heavens and earth. No. But Jesus still takes his cues from God, the Father, and he can't do anything of his own but the one who sent him. It's the Father who bore witness to him. He has to go back to my God and your God. Mary can't even touch him. You don't find any of that. So John is still, Jesus is not the Father. That Christology, that Jesus of the same substance of the Father and is begotten by the Father, that's much, much later. That's developing in the 3rd century, 2nd century and 3rd century, and becomes an official Christian orthodoxy in the 4th century as is promulgated at the Council of Nicaea by Constantine, and is confirmed at the Council of Constantinople by Theodosius in 381. So what we observe is a huge development. John the Baptist's role is diminished in the book of John, and therefore whoever wrote the book of John has no interest at all in elevating John the Baptist. He doesn't need him. But as I mentioned earlier, John the Baptist is in fact almost certainly a historical figure, because just because his execution and so on, it's not germane to the thing, but he was an interesting and important figure. So much so that Luke will want to connect John the Baptist to Jesus by making them cousins. We don't find that in other Gospels. So attaching Jesus to John the Baptist is very important. The Synoptic Gospels, as far as John is concerned, we're way, way past that. I don't need, even though I was the opening act, I don't need to be the opening act for you anymore. I'm the Beatles, so don't need the opening act. I'm Pink Floyd, I'm Led Zeppelin. I don't need anybody else to attach my name to anybody else. My resume is so huge right now, and that's why in Matthew 11, in Matthew 17, we are told that John the Baptist is Elijah. As far as John is concerned, John 1:21, he's saying, I'm not. Why? Because John the Baptist's role is now diminished in the book of John, because Jesus doesn't need anyone. He is, after all, now the Logos. He is now, after all, in the highest possible state that we've ever encountered in the Gospels. And as I mentioned, Jesus' status in the Christian world, in the Christian view, what would become orthodoxy is going to become more elevated, more improved beyond the Gospels as we march into the 2nd century, as we go past Theodosius, as we go past Tertullian, as we go past Origen, and as finally we have Arius and others in Alexandria, and they're going to hammer this all out at the Council of Nicaea. But that's a really excellent question, and the answer to that question really tells us so much about the Gospels themselves. So thank you for joining us.
אדון עולם אשר מלך